The iron bar came down hard across Mei Lin's shoulders, and she would have screamed if sound had ever meant anything to her. But instead she crumpled silently to the dirt outside the saloon, laundry scattering across the dusty street of Silver Ridge, Montana Territory, in the scorching summer of 1876. Above her stood 3 miners, their faces twisted with the kind of hatred that had followed her across an ocean and halfway across a continent. Their mouths moving with words she could not hear but whose meaning she understood perfectly from the violence in their eyes, and the way they pointed at the sign that read, "No Chinamen," that someone had nailed to the saloon's post just that morning. She tried to curl into herself, to make her body smaller, to disappear the way she had learned to disappear in the 2 years since she had arrived in this brutal territory where the mountains scraped the sky, and every day was a battle to survive. But the impact never came. When she opened her eyes, there was a wall of muscle and buckskin between her and the miners, a man so tall and broad that he blocked out the sun, his shadow falling over her like a physical thing. She could not hear his voice, but she could feel it, a rumble that seemed to come up through the earth itself, and she saw the way the miners stepped back, the way their faces went from cruel confidence to something that looked almost like fear. The man's hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and when he turned slightly, she caught a glimpse of his profile, all hard angles and weathered bronze skin, a jaw that could have been carved from the granite of the mountains themselves, and arms thick as tree trunks visible beneath the rolled sleeves of his shirt. He reached down without looking at her, one massive hand extended, and she stared at it stupidly for a moment, unable to comprehend the gesture because kindness was not something she had learned to expect in Silver Ridge. His hand stayed there, steady and patient, and finally she placed her much smaller hand in his and felt herself lifted to her feet with such ease that it was as if she weighed nothing at all. Only then did he turn to face her fully, and she found herself looking up into eyes the color of a winter storm, gray and fierce, and looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. His mouth moved, and she shook her head, pointing to her ears, making the gesture she had made 1,000 times before to indicate that she could not hear. She saw frustration flash across his face, but not the disgust she usually saw when people realized she was deaf. Instead, he held up one finger in a gesture that clearly meant wait, and then turned back to the miners who had begun to advance again, emboldened perhaps by the fact that he had shown concern for a Chinese washerwoman, which surely marked him as either a fool or a traitor to his race. What happened next, Mei Lin watched with wide eyes. The mountain man did not draw a weapon, did not even raise his fists in any formal fighting stance. He simply stood there, and when the first miner swung at him, he caught the man's fist in his hand and squeezed, and even without hearing she could tell from the miner's face that bones were breaking. He released the man and the miner fell to his knees, cradling his hand, and the other 2 looked at each other and then at the mountain man, and apparently decided that whatever point they had been trying to make was not worth the cost of making it. They backed away, dragging their injured companion with them, and the mountain man watched them go with the patience of a predator who knows that the prey is not worth the energy of pursuit. Then he turned back to Mei Lin and gestured to the scattered laundry, and together they began to gather it from the dust, his huge hands surprisingly gentle as he folded the clean shirts and dresses that she had spent all morning washing in the creek behind the boarding house, where she rented a corner of the basement for sleeping. When the laundry was gathered and loaded back into her basket, he pointed at himself and then touched his chest. She understood he was telling her his name, and she watched his lips carefully, trying to read the shapes they made. It looked like Gideon, though she could not be entirely sure. She pointed at herself and said her name, or tried to, knowing that her voice probably sounded strange because she had been deaf since birth and had never heard the sounds that other people made, had learned to speak only through painstaking effort with missionaries who had ultimately given up on her, when they realized she would never be the grateful convert they wanted. He repeated her name, or she thought he did, his lips forming the shapes carefully, and then he picked up her laundry basket as if it weighed no more than a feather and gestured down the street. She hesitated, because trust was not something she could afford, but the sun was beating down and her shoulders ached where the iron bar had struck them, and she was so very tired of fighting every moment of every day just to survive. So she nodded and began to walk, and the mountain man called Gideon walked beside her, carrying her burden as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The boarding house where she lived was at the far end of Silver Ridge, past the assayer's office and the general store and the Chinese laundry where the men would not hire her, because she was a woman and deaf besides. She had tried to explain that she could wash and iron as well as anyone, that her disability did not affect her hands, but they had turned her away, and she had been left to scrape together a living taking in washing from individual miners who did not care about the quality as long as their shirts came back clean, and who paid her half what they would pay anyone else. Gideon followed her down the stairs to the basement entrance, and she saw his jaw tighten when he saw where she lived. It was not much, barely more than a crawl space really, with a ceiling so low that he had to duck his head to enter, and a dirt floor and walls that wept with moisture. Her bedroll was in one corner, and her washing supplies in another, and that was the entirety of her possessions, except for the spare dress that hung from a nail and the small wooden box that contained her mother's jade bracelet, the only thing of her family's that she had managed to keep. He set the laundry basket down and then straightened as much as he could in the low space, and she saw him looking around with an expression she could not quite read. Then he pointed at her and made a gesture that she thought might mean stay here, and he left, his boots heavy on the stairs. She sat down on her bedroll, her whole body shaking now that the danger had passed, and the reality of what had almost happened crashed over her like a wave. She had been beaten before, had learned to accept it as the price of existing in a place where she was unwanted, but today felt different. Today, she had seen murder in those miners' eyes, and she knew that if Gideon had not intervened she would be dead in the street right now, her body left for the dogs because no one would have cared enough to bury a Chinese washerwoman. She did not know how long she sat there, her mind spiraling through dark thoughts, but eventually she became aware of vibrations on the stairs, and she looked up to see Gideon returning. He had a bag with him, and he knelt down beside her and began pulling things out. Bread still warm from the bakery, cheese, apples, a jar of what looked like honey. He laid them out before her like offerings, and she stared at them and then at him, trying to understand what he wanted from her, because in her experience men did not give things without expecting something in return. But he just gestured at the food and then at her mouth, the meaning clear enough, and her stomach growled loudly enough that she felt it even if she could not hear it. She had not eaten since yesterday, had learned to ignore hunger the way she ignored so many other discomforts, but faced with actual food her body betrayed her, and she reached for the bread with trembling hands. She tore off a piece and put it in her mouth, and the taste of it, warm and yeasty, and so much better than the hard tack and moldy scraps she usually ate, brought tears to her eyes. Gideon watched her eat, and there was something in his expression that she might have called sadness, if she had believed that strangers could feel sad about her circumstances. When she had eaten her fill, which was not much because her stomach had shrunk, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and a pencil, He opened it to a blank page and wrote something, then showed it to her. The characters were English, which she could read better than she could speak because the missionaries had at least been good for that much. The message said, "You do not bow to anyone. Do you understand?" She read it twice, trying to make sense of what he meant. She had spent her entire life bowing, first to her parents, then to the family who had bought her, then to the captain of the ship that brought her to America, then to every white person she encountered, because that was how you survived when you had no power. She looked up at him, confusion clear on her face, and he tapped the words insistently and then made a gesture, standing up as much as he could in the low basement and miming someone bowing, and then shaking his head firmly and pointing at her. She understood then, or thought she did. He was telling her that she should not bow, but the idea was so foreign, so impossible that she could not quite grasp it. How could she not bow? She was Chinese, a woman deaf, the lowest of the low in this hierarchy that governed every interaction. Not bowing would mean death, or at least more beatings, more hatred, more of the casual cruelty that defined her existence. She took the pencil from him, her hand shaking, and wrote carefully in the notebook, "They will kill me." He read it and his face went hard, that granite jaw clenching, and he wrote back, "Not while I live." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at them, at this impossible promise from a stranger who owed her nothing, who had no reason to care whether she lived or died, and something cracked open in her chest, some wall she had built to protect herself from hope. She looked up at him and saw that he meant it, saw it in every line of his weathered face, in the fierce protectiveness of his storm-colored eyes, and she did not know what to do with this feeling that was rising in her like flood water. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her shoulder where the iron bar had struck. She flinched, not from pain but from the unexpectedness of gentle touch, and he pulled back immediately and wrote in the notebook, "You are hurt. Let me see." She hesitated, then turned so that he could see her back. She felt his fingers, impossibly gentle for such large hands, pull aside the collar of her shirt, and she knew he must be seeing the bruises, the ones from today and the ones from last week and the week before that, layers of violence written on her skin. His hand fell away, and when she turned back to look at him, his eyes were blazing with a rage that should have frightened her but somehow did not. He wrote, "Who did this?" She took the pencil. "Everyone. It does not matter." His response came quickly, the letters almost violent in their intensity. "It matters." They sat there in the dim basement, looking at each other, and Mei Lin felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, as if the next moment would determine whether she fell or flew. Finally she wrote, "Why do you care?" Gideon stared at the question for a long time, and she watched emotions play across his face, saw him struggle with something internal. Finally he wrote, "I know what it is to be hated for what you are. My mother was Crow. My father was a trapper. Neither people claimed me. I have lived in the mountains alone for 10 years because it is easier than living among those who see you as less than human. When I saw you on the ground today, I saw myself, and I decided I was tired of watching the world be cruel." Mei Lin read his words 3 times, absorbing them, understanding blooming in her chest. She had thought herself alone in her isolation, had thought that no one could understand what it was to be caught between worlds, belonging nowhere. But here was this mountain man, this Gideon, who carried the same loneliness she did, who had chosen solitude over the constant battle of existing where you were not wanted. She wrote, "Thank you for saving me." He shook his head and wrote, "I should have come sooner. I have been in town for 3 days watching. I saw how they treated you. I should have stepped in before today. You were watching me," she wrote, and she could not tell if she should be afraid or flattered. "I came to town for supplies. I saw you at the creek, washing clothes. You were singing." She looked at him sharply. "I cannot hear. I do not know if what I do is singing." "It is singing," he wrote, and there was something almost tender in the way he formed the letters. "It is the most beautiful sound I have heard in 10 years. Heat flooded her face and she looked down at her hands, not knowing what to say to that. No one had ever called anything about her beautiful. She was too dark, too foreign, too broken. Beautiful was not a word that applied to Mei Lin. But Gideon reached out and gently tilted her chin up so she had to look at him, and he wrote with his other hand, awkwardly. "True." She pulled away, overwhelmed, and busied herself with putting away the food he had brought, storing it carefully in her wooden box. When she turned back, he was watching her with that intense gaze that seemed to see right through all her defenses. He wrote, "I have a cabin in the mountains, 3 hours' ride from here. There is a stream, good hunting. I built it large because I thought someday I might have a family, though that seemed foolish for a long time. You could come there. You would be safe." Mei Lin read the offer and her heart began to pound. Go with him, to the mountains, alone. It was madness, was dangerous, was exactly the kind of thing that got women like her killed or worse. And yet when she looked at him, she did not feel afraid. She felt something else entirely, something she did not have a name for. "You do not know me," she wrote. "I know you are strong. I know you survive what would kill others. I know you sing even though you cannot hear. That is enough. People will say terrible things about you, about me, about what we are doing. I do not care what people say. I have not cared for 10 years. She wanted to write, "I am afraid," but pride stopped her. Instead she wrote, "I need time to think." He nodded and stood, having to bend almost double to fit in the space. He wrote one more thing before he left. "I will be at the stable at dawn. If you come, I will take you to safety. If you do not, I will understand. But know this. You deserve better than this basement, better than being beaten in the street. You deserve to live without fear. Think about that." Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs, and Mei Lin was alone with her thoughts and the impossible choice he had laid before her. That night she did not sleep. She lay on her bedroll and felt the dampness seeping through and thought about waking up in this basement every day for the rest of her life, however long or short that might be. She thought about the iron bar across her shoulders, about the hatred in the miner's eyes, about the casual cruelty that met her every time she stepped into the street. She thought about the fact that she was 20 years old and had never known a single day without suffering, had never felt safe, had never been touched with gentleness, except for today when Gideon's large hands had been so careful examining her injuries. She thought about his offer, about a cabin in the mountains, about safety. It seemed too good to be true, seemed like the kind of dream that would turn to nightmare the moment she reached for it. And yet she remembered his words, "Not while I live." Remembered the way he had broken that miner's hand without hesitation, the way he had stood between her and violence like it was the most natural thing in the world. She did not know if she could trust him, but she knew with absolute certainty that she could not stay here. This basement was killing her, slowly but surely, and one day soon the miners or someone like them would finish the job they had started today. She had survived this long, had crossed an ocean and half a continent, and she had not done all that just to die in a moldy basement in Montana territory. When the first light began to filter through the high window, Mei Lin made her decision. She rolled up her bedroll, tied it with cord, and packed her spare dress and her wooden box with her mother's bracelet into the cloth bag she used for carrying laundry. It was not much, the sum total of her life, but it was hers and it was enough. She left the washing supplies because she would not need them anymore, one way or another. The streets were empty as she walked to the stable, the sun just beginning to paint the mountains gold. She expected to find the stable empty, expected that Gideon would have changed his mind in the cold light of dawn, that yesterday had been an aberration brought on by temporary compassion that would not survive the night. But when she pushed open the stable door, there he was, already saddling a huge bay horse, and beside it a smaller dun mare that was also being prepared for travel. He turned when he felt the vibration of her footsteps, and the smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, transforming his stern features into something that made her breath catch. He gestured to the mare and then to her bag, asking without words if she was ready. She nodded, and he took her bag and secured it to the mare's saddle, then helped her mount with his hands on her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. She had ridden before in China, though not often and not well. But the mare seemed gentle, seemed patient with her inexperience, and when Gideon mounted his bay and led the way out of the stable, she followed, her heart pounding with fear and excitement and the strange bubbling feeling that she thought might be hope. They rode through Silver Ridge as it woke, past the saloon where she had nearly died, past the boarding house with its miserable basement, past all the places that had been the borders of her world for 2 years. People stared at them, at the mountain man and the Chinese washerwoman riding together, and she saw their mouths moving, knew they were saying terrible things. But Gideon had been right. She found she did not care. Let them talk. She was leaving and she was never coming back. The trail led up into the mountains, winding through stands of pine and aspen, climbing steadily as the sun rose higher. Mei Lin had never been this far from town, had never seen the territory from this perspective, and despite her fear and uncertainty, she could not help but be awed by the beauty of it. The mountains rose all around them like the walls of the world, their peaks still dusted with snow even in summer, and the sky was a blue so deep it hurt to look at. They rode for what felt like hours, though she had no way to measure time except by the sun's position. Gideon stopped once to let the horses drink from a stream, and he gave her water from his canteen and some of the bread from yesterday. She ate and drank and watched him, this stranger who had upended her life in the space of a day, trying to understand what he wanted from her, what this was really about. He caught her watching and pulled out the notebook. "We are almost there. Another hour, maybe less." She nodded and they mounted again and continued climbing. The air grew thinner, crisper, scented with pine and something else she could not identify. Birds wheeled overhead, and once she saw a deer bounding away through the trees, its white tail flashing. It was so beautiful it made her chest ache, made her realize how starved she had been for anything besides ugliness and cruelty. And then they crested a rise, and there it was. Gideon's cabin, nestled in a meadow with the mountains rising behind it and a stream running along one side. It was larger than she had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows that caught the sunlight. There was a small barn for the horses, a chicken coop, a garden plot that looked recently tended. It looked like a home, like something permanent and real, and she felt tears prick her eyes because she had not had a home since she was a child, before her parents sold her. Gideon dismounted and came to help her down, his hands on her waist again, and this time she let herself lean into his strength for just a moment before stepping away. He led the horses to the barn, and she followed, watching as he unsaddled them and brushed them down with practiced efficiency. Then he picked up her bag and gestured toward the cabin, and she walked beside him across the meadow, her heart in her throat. The inside of the cabin was as well-made as the outside, with a large stone fireplace, a solid table and chairs, a bed in one corner with what looked like actual mattress and quilts, and shelves lined with supplies. There was a rocking chair by the fireplace, and rugs on the wooden floor and curtains at the windows. It was more than functional. It was comfortable, was a place where someone could actually live and not just survive. Gideon set her bag down and went to the fireplace, stirring the coals that must have been banked before he left for town. He added wood and within minutes had a fire going, the warmth spreading through the cabin. Then he turned to her, and she saw uncertainty on his face for the first time, as if he was not sure what to do now that he had brought her here. She reached for the notebook, which he still carried. "Where do I sleep?" He looked at the bed, then at her, and she saw him wrestling with something. Finally he wrote, "You take the bed. I will sleep outside, or I can build another bed. I do not want you to be afraid of me. You are safe here. I will not touch you unless you wish it." The formal precision of the words, the care he took to make his intentions clear, made something twist in her chest. She wrote, "I am not afraid of you." "You should be," he wrote back. "You do not know me. I am a stranger who brought you to an isolated cabin. You should be terrified." "Should," she wrote, "but I am not. I do not know why." They stared at each other across the cabin, and Mei Lin felt the weight of all the unspoken things between them, all the questions and uncertainties, and the strange pull she felt toward this man who had appeared in her life like something out of a story. Finally, Gideon broke the gaze and went to the shelves, pulling down supplies for a meal. She moved to help him, and together they prepared food, working in a silence that felt almost companionable, communicating through gestures and glances. They ate at the table, venison and beans and coffee that Gideon made strong and dark. The food was simple but good, and there was plenty of it, and Mei Lin ate until she was truly full for the first time in months. After, Gideon showed her around the cabin, pointing out where things were stored, how the stove worked, where he kept the water. He showed her the root cellar and the smokehouse, the garden where vegetables were growing, the chicken coop with its half-dozen hens. It was a working homestead, she realized, not just a hunting cabin. Gideon had built a life here, was self-sufficient in a way that spoke of years of practice and hard work. She wondered why he had come to town at all, what had drawn him down from his mountain after 10 years of solitude. As if reading her mind, he pulled out the notebook. "I needed salt and coffee and a few other things I cannot make, and I was lonely. I told myself I was not, but I was. 10 years is a long time to hear only your own voice. But you cannot hear my voice," she wrote back. "I do not need to hear it to know it is there. And you can hear mine through your hands, through the vibrations. We will learn to speak to each other. We have already begun." It was true. Already they had developed a shorthand, a way of communicating that went beyond the notebook, that used gesture and expression and the language of the body. She felt understood by him in a way she had never felt understood by anyone, even when she could see their mouths moving and know they were speaking. That first night, Gideon insisted she take the bed, and he made a bedroll by the fire. She lay in the darkness, feeling the softness of the mattress beneath her, smelling the clean scent of the quilts, and tried to process everything that had happened. Yesterday she had been living in a basement, being beaten in the street. Today she was in a cabin in the mountains with a man she barely knew, safe and warm and fed. It felt unreal, felt like it could be snatched away at any moment, and she did not dare to relax, to let herself believe it was real. But exhaustion eventually claimed her, and she slept more deeply than she had in years. She woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of something cooking. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, and then memory flooded back. Gideon was at the stove, his back to her, and she took a moment to study him in the morning light. He was even larger than she had realized, his shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, his arms thick with muscle that came from years of hard labor. His hair hung loose down his back, and there was something almost wild about him, something that belonged to the mountains and the sky. He turned and saw her awake and gave her that sunrise smile again, and she felt warmth flood through her that had nothing to do with the fire. He gestured to the table where he had laid out breakfast, eggs from the chickens, bread, honey. She rose and went to the wash basin first, cleaning her face and hands, and then joined him at the table. They ate together, and then he showed her how he wanted to try something. He took her hand and placed it flat on his chest, over his heart, and then he spoke. She felt the vibrations, felt the rumble of his voice through her palm, and concentration flooded his face as he spoke slowly, carefully. She could not understand the words, but she could feel them, could sense the rhythm and cadence. He pulled out the notebook. "Could you feel it?" "Yes," she wrote, "but I do not know the words. We will practice. You will learn to feel the shapes of common words. And I will learn your signs if you will teach me." She had some signs, things the missionaries had taught her, ways to communicate basic needs and ideas. She showed him the sign for eat and drink and sleep and thank you. He copied her carefully, his large hands clumsy at first but determined. They spent the morning like that, teaching each other, building a bridge between his world of sound and her world of silence. In the afternoon, Gideon went to work in the garden and she went with him, helping to pull weeds and water the plants. The work was familiar, was soothing, and she found herself relaxing into the rhythm of it. He was patient with her questions, showing her what each plant was, how to tell when vegetables were ready to harvest. She learned that he grew potatoes and onions and carrots, squash and beans, and had an herb garden near the door with things she recognized from Chinese cooking. Garlic and ginger that must have been hard to acquire this far from civilization. When she pointed at the ginger in surprise, he wrote, "I traded for it last year. I thought you might come eventually." She stared at him. "You thought I would come, but you only saw me 3 days ago. I have been coming to town twice a year for supplies. I saw you the first time a year ago. I have been thinking about you since then." The confession was so simple, so direct, that she did not know how to respond. He had been thinking about her for a year, had been planning for her arrival, had planted ginger in case she came. It should have frightened her, should have seemed obsessive, but instead it made her feel precious, made her feel as if she mattered to someone for the first time in her life. "Why?" she wrote simply. He sat back on his heels in the garden dirt, looking at her with those storm-colored eyes. "Because when I saw you, I recognized you. I knew you were alone the way I was alone. I knew you were strong the way I am strong. I knew you had survived things that should have killed you. And I thought, there is someone who could understand me. There is someone who could be a partner, not just a wife to serve me, but a true partner. And I wanted that more than I have wanted anything in 10 years. Mei Lin felt tears spilling down her cheeks, could not stop them, did not try. No one had ever said such things to her. No one had ever seen her as anything but a burden, a defective thing to be used or discarded. But Gideon saw her as strong, as a survivor, as someone worthy of partnership. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, the way he had shown her that morning, and she felt his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. She did not have words for what she wanted to say, but she hoped he could feel it somehow, could understand through the touch what she could not express in writing. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it more firmly against his chest, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the garden with the sun warm on their backs and the mountains standing witness. The days began to develop a rhythm. They woke with the sun and worked together, tending the garden and the chickens, hunting when meat was needed, preserving food for the winter that Gideon said would come early this high in the mountains. He taught her to shoot, placing the rifle in her hands and showing her how to aim, how to feel the recoil. She was not very good at first, but he was patient, and eventually she brought down a rabbit and felt a fierce pride in her accomplishment. He taught her to fish in the stream, to read the water and know where the trout would be hiding. She taught him more signs, and he taught her to feel the vibrations of different words until she could recognize "good morning" and "are you hungry" and "beautiful" through touch alone. That last one he said often, his hand on her arm or her shoulder, or once, daringly, her cheek. And every time she felt it, she blushed and looked away and felt something growing in her chest that was bigger than gratitude, deeper than friendship. She was falling in love with him. She realized one evening as they sat by the fire and he whittled a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. She watched his hands, so large and scarred and capable, creating something delicate and beautiful, and she felt her heart turn over in her chest. She loved the way he moved, all controlled strength and surprising grace for such a big man. She loved the way he looked at her, as if she were something precious. She loved the way he never made her feel less for being deaf, never showed impatience when she did not understand, never treated her as if she were broken. She loved him, and the realization terrified her because she did not know if he felt the same, did not know if his kindness was love or just compassion for someone he saw as a victim. She did not know if she could survive losing him, if it turned out that she had misunderstood everything. But then one night, maybe 3 weeks after she had come to the cabin, Gideon set down his whittling and pulled out the notebook and wrote, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no. You will still be safe here. Nothing will change if you say no. Do you understand?" She nodded, her heart beginning to pound. "May I court you? Properly, the way a man should court a woman he hopes to marry. I know it has only been a few weeks, but I have been thinking about you for a year, and living with you for these weeks has only made me more certain. You are everything I thought you would be and more. You are strong and clever and kind, and you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. I want to build a life with you if you will have me, but I will not rush you. We can take all the time you need." Mei Lin read the words 3 times, her hands shaking. He wanted to court her, wanted to marry her, wanted to build a life with her. It was everything she had not let herself hope for, everything she thought was impossible for someone like her. She took the pencil, her hand unsteady. "You could have any woman. Why choose me? I am deaf. I am Chinese. People will hate you for being with me. I do not want any woman. I want you. And I told you I do not care what people think. I have not cared for 10 years. As for you being deaf, that does not matter to me. We communicate just fine. Better than I communicated with anyone when I could hear their voices. Your being Chinese matters only in that it means you understand what it is to be caught between worlds. My mother was Crow, remember. I am half Indian in a country that is trying to destroy Indians. We are both outsiders. That makes us perfect for each other." She felt tears streaming down her face again, and she wrote, "Yes, yes, I want that too. I was afraid to hope, but yes." Gideon read her answer, and his whole face transformed, that smile breaking across it like the sun coming out from clouds. He stood and came around the table and knelt before her chair, taking both her hands in his. He spoke, and she felt the vibrations and knew he was saying something important. Then he pulled her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles, first one hand and then the other, and the tenderness of it made her sob. He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and feeling his heart beating against her cheek, strong and steady and real. His arms came around her, and she felt surrounded by him, protected by him, cherished by him. She had never been held like this, had never felt safe enough to let herself be vulnerable, But with Gideon she felt as if she could finally let down her guard, could finally stop fighting long enough to simply feel. They stayed like that for a long time, and when she finally pulled back to look at him, he cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical touch. Then slowly, giving her time to pull away, he leaned in and kissed her forehead, gentle as a benediction. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Mei Lin had imagined. Gideon was thoughtful and creative in his affection, finding ways to show her he cared that did not rely on words. He picked wildflowers and left them on her pillow. He made her a chair that was the perfect height for her to sit comfortably at the table. He showed her secret places in the mountains, a waterfall that sent spray up in rainbows, a meadow where elk came to graze at dawn, a hot spring where the water bubbled up warm from deep in the earth. At the hot spring, he carefully turned his back while she bathed, standing guard to make sure she was safe. And the consideration of it, the respect for her modesty, made her love him even more. When she was done, she tapped his shoulder and he turned and saw her with her hair wet and streaming down her back, and the look on his face made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. He courted her through the changing of the seasons, through late summer into fall when the aspens turned gold and the air grew crisp. He taught her to preserve food for winter, to smoke meat and pickle vegetables, and make jam from the wild berries that grew on the mountainside. She taught him the Chinese way of cooking, using the ginger and garlic he had planted, making dumplings with dough and venison, making tea from herbs that grew nearby. They worked together in an easy partnership, each contributing their skills, learning from each other. He was strong where she was quick, patient where she was determined. They balanced each other, and Mei Lin began to understand what he had meant about wanting a partner. This was nothing like the stories she had heard of marriage, where the woman served and the man commanded. This was equality, was mutual respect and affection, was two people building something together. And through it all, Gideon was unfailingly gentle with her, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. He held her hand when they walked. He kissed her cheek when they parted in the morning to do separate tasks. He let her sleep in the bed while he took the bedroll by the fire, even though she had begun to wish he would ask to share the bed, would hold her through the night the way he held her in his arms when they sat by the fire in the evening. One night in early October, as the first snow dusted the peaks above them, Mei Lin made a decision. She waited until they were sitting by the fire, until Gideon had his arm around her shoulders and she was leaning against his warmth, and then she pulled out the notebook and wrote, "I want you to sleep in the bed with me. I want to be your wife in truth, not just in name. I want all of you, Gideon. I am ready." He read the words and she felt his whole body go tense. He pulled back to look at her, searching her face, and she met his gaze steadily, letting him see that she was certain. Then he wrote, "Are you sure? We can wait. We are not even formally married yet." "I am sure," she wrote. "I do not need a formal ceremony to know that I am yours and you are mine. We have been married in all the ways that matter since the day you told me I do not bow to anyone." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood and pulled her to her feet. He led her to the bed and sat her down on the edge of it, and then he knelt before her and began to unlace her boots, removing them with careful precision. Then he stood and offered his hand, and when she took it, he drew her to her feet. What followed was a revelation. Gideon made love to her with the same patience and gentleness he showed in everything else, taking his time, making sure she was comfortable, checking in with her constantly through touch and glances. He was reverent, as if she were something holy, and he showed her that physical intimacy could be beautiful instead of brutal, could be a conversation instead of a conquest. Afterward, She lay in his arms, her head on his chest, feeling his heart beat beneath her cheek, and she felt complete in a way she had never felt before. She had spent her whole life feeling broken, defective, less than whole. But here in this cabin in the mountains, in the arms of this man who saw her as perfect exactly as she was, she finally felt like she belonged somewhere. Gideon's hand moved in slow circles on her back, soothing and possessive all at once, and she tilted her head up to look at him. In the firelight his face was all planes and shadows, beautiful in its strength, and she reached up to trace his jaw with her fingertips. He caught her hand and pressed it to his lips, and she felt him say something against her palm, felt the vibrations of words she knew without needing to hear them. The next morning, Gideon woke her with kisses and wrote in the notebook that he was going to ride to the nearest town, a full day's journey, to find a preacher or a judge who could marry them properly. She protested that it was not necessary, that they were already married in the ways that mattered, but he insisted. "I want you to have my name legally," he wrote. "I want there to be papers that say you are my wife, so that if anything happens to me, this land is yours. I want you protected in every way possible." She understood then that this was not about religion or propriety, but about security, about making sure she would never be left vulnerable again. So she nodded and helped him pack supplies for the journey, and she watched him ride away with a fear she had not expected, a terror that he would not come back, that this happiness was too fragile to last. But he did come back, 2 days later, with a traveling preacher who had agreed to perform the ceremony. The preacher was an old man with kind eyes who did not seem bothered by the fact that the bride was Chinese and deaf, or that the groom was half-Crow. He performed the ceremony in the cabin, with the fire crackling and the October wind howling outside, and he pronounced them husband and wife in the eyes of God and the law. Gideon kissed her when it was done, a proper kiss this time, deep and claiming, and the preacher chuckled and said something that made Gideon grin. Then the preacher shared their wedding dinner and left the next morning, taking with him a gold coin that Mei Lin had not known Gideon possessed, and leaving behind the marriage certificate that bore both their names, Gideon Cross and Mei Lin Cross. Mei Lin stared at the paper at her new name and felt something settle in her chest. She was Mei Lin Cross now. She belonged somewhere. She belonged to someone, and he belonged to her, and the belonging was mutual and chosen and precious. Winter came to the mountains with a fury that Mei Lin had not anticipated. The snow fell in great white curtains, piling up around the cabin until Gideon had to dig paths to the barn and the chicken coop. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, isolated from the world, and Mei Lin found she did not mind at all. She had everything she needed here, warmth and food and the man she loved. They spent the long winter nights by the fire, and Gideon taught her to read better, going through the few books he owned line by line until she could read English as well as she could write it. She taught him Chinese characters, showing him how to write her original name, the one her parents had given her. He practiced it carefully, wanting to honor that part of her heritage even as she took his name. They talked through the notebook about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Gideon told her about his mother, who had loved a white trapper and been cast out by her tribe for it. He told her about growing up caught between two worlds, never fully accepted by either, and about how his father had died when he was 12, and his mother had followed a year later, leaving him alone. He had survived by living with trappers and traders, learning to hunt and track and live off the land, until finally, he had saved enough to buy this plot of land and build his cabin and retreat from a world that had never wanted him. Mei Lin told him about China, about parents so poor they had sold her to a wealthy family as a servant. She told him about realizing she was deaf when the other servants mocked her for not responding to commands, about learning to read lips and to speak well enough to be understood even though she could not hear her own voice. She told him about the family deciding she was too defective to keep, about being sold to a man who trafficked workers to America, about the terrible journey across the ocean and arriving in San Francisco only to find that the streets were not paved with gold, that Chinese were hated here as much as anywhere. She told him about making her way to Montana Territory, following rumors of mining towns where workers were needed, hoping to find some place where she could survive. She told him about the basement and the beatings and the grinding poverty, and about the day she had decided she would rather die fighting than live on her knees, only to have him appear like something out of a dream and tell her she did not bow to anyone. "You saved my life," she wrote, tears on her cheeks. "You saved mine," he wrote back. "I was dying up here slowly of loneliness. I told myself I preferred solitude, but I was lying. You brought me back to life." They made love by the firelight, slow and tender, and Mei Lin thought that she had never been happier than she was in this moment, snowbound in a cabin in the mountains with the man who had taught her that she deserved to be loved. Spring came late to the high country, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The snow melted and the meadow exploded with wildflowers, and the stream ran high and fast with runoff. Mei Lin worked in the garden, planting seeds for the new year, and felt a different kind of seed growing inside her, a new life that she had suspected for a few weeks now, but had not been certain of until she missed her monthly time for the second cycle in a row. She told Gideon that evening, watching his face as he read the words, "I think I am with child." The joy that flooded his expression was so intense it took her breath away. He pulled her into his arms and spun her around, and then set her down carefully as if suddenly afraid he might hurt her. He placed his hand on her still flat belly and looked at her with wonder, and she saw tears in his eyes, this strong mountain man crying with happiness. They spent the rest of the evening planning, talking about how they would need to build a cradle, how they would need to prepare for winter with an infant, how they would manage when the baby came. Gideon was nervous, afraid he would not be a good father, and Mei Lin reassured him that he would be wonderful, that any child would be lucky to have him. The baby grew inside her as the summer progressed, and Gideon was attentive to the point of being overprotective, not wanting her to work too hard, constantly making sure she was eating enough and resting enough. She found it endearing even when it was frustrating, this evidence of how much he cared. In late summer, when her belly was round and tight, and the baby kicked strongly enough that Gideon could feel it when he placed his hand on her stomach, they had a scare. Mei Lin had been picking berries when she felt a sharp pain in her back, and then a gush of fluid between her legs. Terror flooded her because it was too early. The baby was not due for another month at least, and she stumbled back to the cabin and found Gideon and grabbed his hand and placed it on her belly, so he could feel the contraction starting. He understood immediately, and his face went pale, but he did not panic. He got her into bed, made her comfortable, and then rode hard for the nearest settlement where there was a midwife. He was gone for hours that felt like days, and Mei Lin labored alone, terrified that something was wrong, that she would lose this baby that she already loved so much. But Gideon returned with the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Johnson who took one look at Mei Lin and started giving orders. The labor was hard and long, made harder by the fact that Mei Lin could not hear the midwife's encouragement, could only see her lips moving and feel Gideon's hand in hers, gripping tight as if he could lend her his strength. Finally, after what felt like forever, the baby came in a rush of pain and relief. Mei Lin collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted, and waited to hear crying, then remembered she would not hear it and opened her eyes instead to see Mrs. Johnson holding a tiny, squirming infant, its mouth open in what must be wails. "Boy," Mrs. Johnson's lips said, and she placed the baby on Mei Lin's chest, and Mei Lin looked down at her son and felt love so overwhelming she thought it might destroy her. He was perfect, tiny and red and furious at being born, and when Gideon leaned over to look at him, she saw the same overwhelming love on his face. They named him James, after Gideon's father, and he was a healthy, lusty baby despite coming early. Mrs. Johnson stayed for a few days to make sure Mei Lin recovered properly, and Gideon paid her generously for her trouble. When she left, the three of them were alone, a family, and Mei Lin felt as if her life had finally, truly begun. James grew quickly, and Mei Lin discovered that being deaf did not make her a bad mother. She could not hear him cry, but she could see him, could feel the vibrations when he wailed, could learn to read his expressions and his needs. Gideon helped, taking night shifts when the baby needed changing or feeding, and they managed together the way they managed everything. When James was 6 months old, Gideon decided they needed to make a trip to the nearest town to register the birth, and to buy supplies they could not make or grow. Mei Lin was nervous about going back to civilization, even a different town than the one where she had lived before, but Gideon assured her it would be fine. It was not fine. The town was small, barely more than a trading post and a few buildings, but the people there took one look at the mixed family, the white and Indian mountain man with the Chinese wife and the half-Chinese baby, and their faces closed with hostility. The clerk at the trading post refused to serve them. The postmaster said he had no record of any marriage certificate, even though Gideon showed him the paper. People stared and whispered and made no effort to hide their disgust. Mei Lin felt the old familiar fear rising, the sense that violence was always just a breath away when you were different. But Gideon stood tall, his hand on the small of her back, protective and possessive. When a group of men started to approach them with clear ill intent, Gideon simply looked at them, and something in his eyes, some promise of violence, made them reconsider. They got what supplies they could and left quickly, and Mei Lin thought that was the end of it. But a week later, a group of men rode up to the cabin. Mei Lin saw them coming and felt ice flood her veins. She grabbed James and ran inside, barring the door, and looked for Gideon. He was coming back from the stream, and she saw him see the riders, saw him change direction to intercept them before they reached the cabin. She could not hear what was said, but she could see the confrontation, could see the way Gideon stood between the riders and his home, could see the leader of the group gesturing angrily. Then one of the men raised a rifle, pointing it at Gideon, and Mei Lin's heart stopped, but Gideon was faster. He moved like lightning, covering the distance between himself and the mounted man in seconds, pulling him from his horse before he could fire. The rifle went off, the bullet going wild, and then Gideon had the man on the ground and was hitting him with methodical precision, each blow calculated to hurt but not to kill. The other riders hesitated, clearly not expecting this level of violence from a lone man. But Gideon stood up from the unconscious man at his feet and looked at them, and even from the cabin Mei Lin could see the promise in his stance. "Come at me, and this is what happens." The riders looked at each other, looked at their fallen companion, and apparently decided it was not worth it. They picked up the unconscious man, threw him over his horse, and rode away. Gideon watched them go, and then he turned and walked back to the cabin, and Mei Lin unbarred the door and threw herself into his arms, James squashed between them. "We cannot stay here," she wrote when she could control her shaking hands enough to hold the pencil. "They will come back with more men. They will kill you." But Gideon shook his head. "This is our home. This is our land. I will not run, and I will not let them drive us away. We have as much right to be here as anyone. They do not care about rights. They care that we are different. Then they will learn to accept us, or they will learn to leave us alone. I am not afraid of them. I am afraid," she wrote, and it was the truth, raw and painful. "I am afraid they will take you from me. I am afraid James will grow up without a father. I am afraid every day that this happiness will be stolen." Gideon took the notebook from her and wrote, "I promised you that you would be safe while I live. That promise extends to our son. I will protect you both with everything I am. Trust me." She wanted to argue, wanted to make him understand that this was different, that this was not just casual cruelty but organized hatred, the kind that got people killed. But she saw the determination in his face, the absolute refusal to back down, and she realized that this was who he was. Gideon did not run. Gideon did not bow. He had told her that on the first day, and he had been trying to teach it to her ever since. So she nodded, and she trusted him, and she tried not to let the fear consume her. The men did come back a few weeks later with more riders and more guns, but Gideon was ready for them. He had spent the weeks preparing, setting traps around the approaches to the cabin, creating defensive positions. When the riders came, they found themselves riding into a nightmare of tripwires and deadfalls and a mountain man who fought like a demon. Mei Lin watched from the cabin, James in her arms, as Gideon defended their home. He was magnificent and terrifying, using the terrain to his advantage, using his knowledge of the land to turn their numbers against them. He wounded 3 men before the rest retreated, and this time when they left, Mei Lin thought they would not be back. She was right. Word apparently spread that the mountain man was not to be trifled with, that his Chinese wife and half-breed child were under his protection, and that anyone who bothered them would pay a steep price. They were left alone after that, and slowly Mei Lin began to relax, began to believe that maybe they could have this, could have a life together without constant threat. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. James grew into a bright, curious boy who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's delicate features, and a spirit that belonged entirely to himself. Gideon taught him to hunt and track and survive in the mountains, and Mei Lin taught him Chinese and how to read and the value of kindness. He grew up speaking with his hands as often as his voice, because that was how his mother understood, and he thought nothing of the fact that his family was different from others. When James was 5, Mei Lin gave birth to twin girls, Sarah and Emma, who were as different as night and day despite looking identical. Sarah was quiet and thoughtful, happy to sit with her mother and learn to sew and cook. Emma was wild, following her father everywhere, wanting to learn everything he knew about the mountains and the animals. Gideon doted on both of them, this man who had thought he would never have a family now surrounded by children who adored him. And through it all, Mei Lin and Gideon grew deeper in love, their partnership strengthening with each challenge overcome, each joy shared. They still communicated through touch and signs and the notebook, but they had developed a language all their own, one that needed no words. They could read each other with a glance, could understand each other's needs almost before they were expressed. On their 10th anniversary, Gideon took Mei Lin back to the hot spring where he had once stood guard while she bathed. But this time he joined her in the water, and they made love under the stars with the steam rising around them, and Mei Lin thought about how far she had come from that terrified girl in the basement, how far they had both come from the lonely people they had been. "Do you remember," she wrote later, lying in his arms, "when you told me I do not bow to anyone, he nodded, his hand moving in lazy circles on her bare shoulder. "That was the moment my life began," she wrote. "Everything before that was just surviving. Everything after has been living. Thank you for teaching me the difference." He took the pencil from her. "You taught me the difference too. Before you, I was just existing. You made me want to live again, made me want to build something instead of just hiding. We saved each other." It was true. They had saved each other. Two broken people who had found wholeness in each other, who had built a life out of determination and love, and the stubborn refusal to let the world's cruelty define them. When James was 15, tall and strong like his father but with his mother's grace, he asked about going to town to see the wider world. Mei Lin's first instinct was to say no, to keep him safe on the mountain where she could protect him. But Gideon pointed out that they could not keep the children isolated forever, that they needed to learn to navigate the world even if the world was hostile. So they made trips to town, the whole family together, and yes, people stared, and yes, they faced prejudice and hatred. But Gideon and Mei Lin taught their children to stand tall, to be proud of who they were, to never bow to anyone's expectations of what they should be. James learned to fight when he needed to, but to walk away when he could. The twins learned that their mixed heritage was not a shame, but a strength, that they carried the best of multiple worlds in their blood. When James was 18, he fell in love with a girl from town, a shopkeeper's daughter with red hair and green eyes who did not care that he was half Chinese and quarter Crow. He brought her to meet his parents, nervous and hopeful, and Mei Lin and Gideon welcomed her with open arms, seeing in her acceptance of their son the same kind of courage that had brought them together. They married that fall, and Gideon built them a cabin on the far side of the meadow, close enough to help but far enough to give them privacy. And when James and his bride had their first child, a daughter with red hair and gray eyes, Mei Lin held her granddaughter and felt the circle complete itself. This child would grow up knowing she was loved, knowing she belonged, never having to wonder if she was wanted. This child would have what Mei Lin had fought so hard to give her own children: safety, security, and the knowledge that family was everything. The twins grew and went their separate ways. Sarah married a Chinese man from the next territory over, someone who understood her heritage and valued it, and they built a life together, raising horses and children. Emma never married, preferring the freedom of the mountains, becoming a guide and tracker so skilled that people came from far away to hire her. And if they had a problem with her being a woman or half Chinese, they learned to get over it when they saw her skill. Gideon and Mei Lin grew old together in the cabin they had built into a home. Their hair grayed and their bodies slowed, but the love between them never dimmed. They still communicated through touch and signs, still sat by the fire in the evenings, still made each other laugh with shared memories of the years they had built together. On a spring morning when Mei Lin was 62 years old, she woke to find Gideon's side of the bed cold. Fear seized her heart and she rose quickly, looking for him, and found him sitting in his rocking chair by the window, looking out at the meadow where the wildflowers were blooming. She went to him and touched his shoulder, and he turned to her and smiled that sunrise smile that had never failed to make her heart skip. He pulled her into his lap, and she went willingly despite their age, settling against his chest and feeling his heart beating beneath her cheek. They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun rise over the mountains, and Mei Lin thought that this was happiness, this simple moment of peace with the man she loved. Gideon's hand moved to the notebook that was never far away, and he wrote, "Do you have any regrets?" She took the pencil. "Not a single one. Every hard thing led me to you. Every scar was worth it for this life we built. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "I love you," he wrote, and she felt him say it against her hair, felt the vibrations of the words she had learned to recognize in the first weeks of knowing him. "I love you too," she wrote, "for all of my days and all of my nights. You are my home." They sat together as the sun climbed higher, and Mei Lin felt at peace in a way she had never imagined possible in those dark days in Silver Ridge when death had seemed preferable to continued suffering. She had survived, and more than survived, had thrived, had built a family and a legacy. Her children and grandchildren knew they were loved, knew they were valued, knew they did not bow to anyone. And it had all started with a mountain man who had stood between her and violence, who had told her she deserved better, who had loved her when she thought she was unlovable. Gideon had given her the world, had given her herself, had shown her that strength was not just about surviving but about choosing to live fully, to love deeply, to build something beautiful out of the ruins of the past. Years continued to pass in gentle succession. Their grandchildren grew and had children of their own, and the meadow that had once been so isolated became the center of a small community of people who valued family over prejudice, who measured worth by character instead of race. The cabin that Gideon had built was added onto, expanded, became a gathering place where multiple generations shared meals and stories and love. Mei Lin taught her grandchildren and great-grandchildren the signs she used, the ways of communicating that did not require sound. Some of them learned Chinese from her, wanting to understand that part of their heritage. They asked her questions about China, about her journey to America, about the hard years before she met Gideon. She answered honestly, not hiding the pain but also not letting it overshadow the joy that came after. "Your grandfather saved me," she would write, and the children would nod seriously, having heard the story many times but never tiring of it. "And you saved him," they would respond, because they had heard that part too, had heard how Grandpa Gideon had been dying of loneliness before Grandma Mei Lin brought him back to life. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the family threw a celebration that brought people from 3 territories. James and his wife came with their grown children and grandchildren. Sarah came with her huge extended family, her husband's relatives mixing with hers in a joyful chaos. Emma came in from wherever her travels had taken her, bringing gifts and stories of the wider world. The meadow filled with people who had been touched by Gideon and Mei Lin's love, who had learned from their example that family was what you made it, that love could bridge any divide. There was music and dancing, and though Mei Lin could not hear it, she could feel the vibrations through the ground, and she danced anyway, first with Gideon and then with each of her children and grandchildren in turn. People gave speeches that she read on their lips or in hastily scribbled notes, telling stories of times when Gideon and Mei Lin had helped them, had shown them kindness, had stood up for them when others would not. When it was done, and the guests had finally departed, and the sun was setting behind the mountains, Gideon and Mei Lin walked to the hot spring, just the two of them. They eased into the warm water, their old bodies grateful for the heat, and they held each other and looked up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. 50 years, Gideon wrote on a piece of paper he had brought, the words shaky because his hands were not as steady as they once were. 50 years, Mei Lin agreed, and I would take 50 more if we could have them. We will take what we are given and be grateful, he wrote. Every day with you is a gift. They stayed in the spring until the water cooled, and then they walked slowly back to the cabin, hand in hand, their path lit by moonlight. Inside, they settled into their bed, the same bed they had shared for 50 years, and Gideon pulled Mei Lin against his chest, and she settled there with the familiarity of long practice. His heart beat beneath her cheek, steady and strong despite his age, and she matched her breathing to its rhythm. She felt his hand moving in slow circles on her back, the same soothing gesture he had used since their first night together, and she felt safe and loved and complete. "Thank you," she wrote on his chest with her finger, tracing the letters against his skin. He caught her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her palm, and she felt him speak against it, felt the shape of words she knew by heart. "I love you, Mei Lin Cross, today and always." She pressed closer, wanting to memorize this moment, this feeling, wanting to carry it with her wherever their journey led next. They had built something beautiful, she and this mountain man who had demanded she not bow to anyone. They had taken their broken pieces and made something whole, had created love and family and hope out of pain and loneliness and fear. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would carry forward the lessons they had learned, would remember that strength came in many forms, that love could conquer hatred, that family was not about blood but about choice and commitment and showing up for each other day after day, year after year. As sleep claimed her, Mei Lin smiled against Gideon's chest, thinking about that day so long ago in Silver Ridge when she had been lying in the dirt, certain she was about to die. She had been so afraid then, so certain that her story would end badly. But Gideon had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to pray, and he had changed everything. He had taught her to stand tall, to claim her worth, to build a life instead of just surviving. And in return, she had given him purpose, had filled his empty cabin with love and laughter and the sound of children's voices. They had saved each other in all the ways that mattered, and the legacy of that salvation would ripple forward through generations. The morning light eventually found them still entwined, Gideon's arms secure around Mei Lin, her head still resting over his heart. They woke slowly, the way old couples do, taking their time to greet the new day. Gideon's eyes opened first, and he looked down at his wife of 50 years, at the gray in her black hair, and the lines on her face and the beauty that had only deepened with time. She felt him wake and tilted her head to look up at him, and the smile that passed between them held all the history of their years together, all the struggles overcome and joys shared. He cupped her face in his weathered hand, and she leaned into the touch, this gesture of affection so familiar it was like breathing. They rose together and began their day the way they had begun thousands of days before, moving through the cabin in comfortable synchronicity, preparing breakfast, tending to the small tasks that kept their home running. James came by in the afternoon with 2 of his grandchildren, young boys who wanted to learn to track from their great-grandfather, and Gideon took them into the woods with the patience he had shown all his children and grandchildren. Mei Lin watched them go, the old man and the young boys, and felt grateful beyond measure. This life, this family, this love, it was more than she had ever dreamed possible in those dark days before Gideon. She had learned that she was strong, that she was worthy, that she deserved happiness. And she had learned it because one man had been brave enough to stand between her and violence, to offer her a choice, to show her that another way was possible. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Winter came and spring followed, and summer blazed hot before giving way to fall. Gideon and Mei Lin moved more slowly with each passing year, but they moved together, supporting each other through the aches and pains that came with age. When Gideon's eyesight began to fail, Mei Lin became his eyes, describing the world for him in their notebooks. When Mei Lin's hands grew stiff with arthritis, Gideon massaged them gently every morning and evening, working the joints until she could grip her pencil again. They had weathered everything life threw at them: prejudice and violence, isolation and hardship, the challenges of raising children in a hostile world. They had done it together, and their partnership had only grown stronger through each trial. Their children and grandchildren knew they were witnessing something rare and precious, a love that had lasted half a century and showed no signs of dimming. On a crisp autumn day when Mei Lin was 71 years old, Gideon took her hand and led her to the meadow. The aspens were gold, the sky was impossibly blue, and the mountains stood eternal around them. He had his notebook and he wrote, "Do you remember when I first brought you here? You looked so afraid, so ready to run, but you stayed." "I stayed because I saw something in you," she wrote back. "I saw someone who understood what it meant to be alone. I saw someone who had survived. I saw someone I could trust. You gave me everything," he wrote, and his hand was shaking. "I was dead inside before you came. You brought me back to life. You gave me children and grandchildren and a legacy. You gave me purpose. You gave me love. I need you to know that every day with you has been the greatest gift of my life." She read his words through tears, understanding suddenly why he had brought her here, why he was saying these things now. She looked up at him and saw a knowledge in his eyes, an acceptance of something inevitable. "How long have you known?" she wrote. "A few months. The doctor in town says my heart is failing. I have a year, maybe less." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had known they would not live forever, had known that one of them would have to face life without the other eventually. But knowing it abstractly and facing the reality were two different things. "We will fight," she wrote fiercely. "We will find another doctor, better treatment. We will." He stopped her hand gently. "No, my love. I am 73 years old. I have lived a full life, a good life. I have known love and family and purpose. I am not afraid of what comes next. I only want to make sure you are provided for, that you will be safe when I am gone." "I do not want to be safe without you," she wrote, tears streaming down her face. "I want you, I need you." "You are strong enough to go on without me," he wrote. "I have always known that. You survived before we met, and you will survive after I am gone. Our children will take care of you. Our grandchildren will cherish you. You will not be alone." But she would be, she thought. She would be alone in all the ways that mattered, because no one else would ever understand her the way Gideon did, would ever love her the way Gideon loved her. He had been her home for 50 years, and the thought of existing in the world without him was unbearable. They spent the remaining months loving each other fiercely, squeezing every drop of joy from the time they had left. Gideon made sure all his affairs were in order, made sure the land was legally Mei Lin's, made sure his children and grandchildren understood their responsibility to care for her. He wrote letters to each of them, messages to be opened after his death, full of wisdom and love and the lessons he wanted them to remember. And he spent his evenings with Mei Lin, holding her close, reminding her of all the good times they had shared. He made her promise that she would not give up when he was gone, that she would keep living, keep loving, keep being the strong woman he had always known her to be. Winter came early that year, and Gideon grew weaker as the snow piled up. He spent most of his time in the rocking chair by the fire, wrapped in quilts, and Mei Lin sat beside him, holding his hand, unwilling to leave his side even to sleep. Their children came and went, paying their respects, saying their goodbyes, though Gideon tried to make it less somber, tried to fill the cabin with laughter and stories of good times. On a night when the wind howled and the snow fell thick, Gideon's breathing grew labored. The family gathered, filling the cabin with their presence, and Mei Lin climbed into the rocking chair with him, settling in his lap the way she had done so many times over the years. His arms came around her, weaker now but still protective, and she pressed her face against his neck and felt his pulse beating beneath her lips. She felt his hand move, tracing letters on her back, and she concentrated on understanding the message. "Do not bow to anyone. Promise me." She pulled back to look at him, to see his beloved face one more time, and she nodded through her tears. "I promise." He smiled, that sunrise smile she had loved for 50 years, and then he spoke, and though she could not hear the words, she felt them against her hand on his chest. "I love you, Mei Lin. Wait for me on the other side." She felt his heart beat once, twice, 3 times more, and then stop. She felt the moment his spirit left his body, felt the change in the weight of him, the stillness. And she held him and sobbed, great silent sobs that shook her whole body, mourning the loss of the man who had been her everything. The family gathered around them, supporting her, weeping with her, sharing in the grief. They sat vigil through the night, honoring Gideon's memory, celebrating his life. And when morning came, they prepared his body and buried him in the meadow he had loved, beneath an aspen tree with a view of the mountains. Mei Lin stood at his grave and felt as if part of herself had been buried with him. But she also felt his presence, felt his spirit in the wind and the mountains and the very ground beneath her feet. He was gone but not gone, would always be with her in the memories they had made, the family they had created, the love they had shared. She kept her promise. She did not bow, not to grief, not to loneliness, not to the weight of all the years she would have to live without him. She stayed in the cabin they had built together, surrounded by family, teaching her great-great-grandchildren the signs she used, telling stories of the mountain man who had saved her life and loved her unconditionally. She lived to be 89 years old, and when she finally felt death approaching, she was not afraid. She lay in the bed she had shared with Gideon, surrounded by the people who loved her, and she felt at peace. She had lived a full life, had known deep love, had created a legacy that would outlast her physical body. As her breathing slowed, she felt a presence in the room, a familiar warmth. And though her eyes were closed, she saw him. Gideon, young and strong the way he had been when they first met, standing at the foot of the bed with his hand extended. She felt herself rise, felt the pain and weariness of her old body fall away, and she took his hand. He pulled her close, and she felt his heart beating against her cheek once more, strong and steady and eternal. "You kept your promise," he said, and she heard him, actually heard his voice for the first time, rich and deep and beautiful. "I kept my promise," she agreed, and her own voice sounded clear and true to her own ears. "I did not bow." "I am so proud of you," he said. "Now come, we have eternity to spend together." And hand in hand, the mountain man and his beloved wife walked into the light, leaving behind a legacy of love and strength, and the simple truth that family is what you make it, that love can conquer hatred, and that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a stranger who sees your worth when everyone else sees only your differences. Their great-great-grandchildren told the story for generations. Of Mei Lin, the deaf Chinese washerwoman who survived everything the world threw at her, and Gideon, the mountain man who taught her she did not bow to anyone. They told of a love that lasted 50 years, and then forever, of a family built from broken pieces, of 2 people who saved each other, and in doing so created something beautiful. And in the meadow where Gideon was buried, where Mei Lin was laid to rest beside him, the wildflowers grew thick and beautiful every spring, as if the earth itself was celebrating the love that had flourished there. The cabin stood for many years, maintained by descendants who understood its significance, who wanted to preserve the place where their family's story began. The story of Gideon and Mei Lin became legend in the territory, passed down through generations as a reminder that love sees no boundaries, that strength comes in many forms, and that the most powerful thing we can do is to stand up for someone who cannot stand for themselves. It was a story of hope in dark times, of courage in the face of hatred, of two people who refused to let the world's cruelty define them. And at its heart was a simple truth that Gideon had spoken on that first day in Silver Ridge, the words that had changed everything. You do not bow to anyone. It was a commandment and a promise, a declaration of worth and a challenge to the world. It was the foundation of everything that came after, the bedrock of a love that transcended death and a legacy that would last forever. Their story ended not in tragedy but in triumph, not in separation but in reunion, not in defeat but in the victory of two people who had chosen love over fear, who had built something beautiful from nothing, who had proven that the human spirit, when met with compassion and courage, could overcome any obstacle. And so the story concluded, not with an ending but with a continuation, with generations carrying forward the lessons learned, with love multiplying and spreading like the wildflowers in the meadow, with the absolute certainty that Gideon and Mei Lin's love had changed the world, one person, one family, one generation at a time. Their descendants continued to thrive, carrying forward the values they had learned from their remarkable ancestors. They were doctors and teachers, ranchers and artists, guides and entrepreneurs. They married people of all races and backgrounds, building families that reflected the diversity their great-grandparents had embraced. And every single one of them knew the story, knew where they came from, knew that they carried within them the legacy of two people who had refused to bow, who had chosen love, who had built something lasting from pain and hope and determination. The cabin eventually became a historical site, preserved by the family and the state as a testament to the courage of those who had come before. People visited from all over, wanting to see where this legendary love story had unfolded, wanting to stand in the meadow and imagine the mountain man and the deaf Chinese washerwoman building their life together against all odds. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the aspens and the stars emerged bright and clear, people said you could feel their presence still, could sense the love that had sanctified this ground, could understand that some bonds are too strong to be broken even by death. The story of Gideon and Mei Lin Cross lived on, a testament to the power of love, the strength of the human spirit, and the simple truth that we are all worthy of dignity, respect, and the chance to build something beautiful, no matter where we come from or what obstacles we face. It was a story with a happy ending, but more than that, it was a story with a meaningful ending, one that reminded everyone who heard it that choosing love is always the right choice, that standing up for others is always worth the cost, and that family, whether born or chosen, is the greatest treasure we can ever have. And so the tale concluded, fully and completely, with all threads resolved, all promises kept, all loves fulfilled. Gideon and Mei Lin had found each other against impossible odds, had built a life together that defied every expectation, had created a legacy that would outlast them by generations. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than they found it. That was their story. That was their triumph. That was their forever.